Right, what's good, everyone? So, Trinidad's been under a state of emergency for a while now. You've got Carnival coming up, you've got an election coming up, and the country is still under a state of emergency. I don't know if you've seen much change in terms of crime. You may have seen a small percentage um, in terms of the amount of crime being committed. As people are just being a bit more careful now, or they're being a bit smarter with how they do their crime committing, for want of a better phrase. Um, Now, was a state of emergency going to work in Trinidad? No, it's not going to work. It's not going to solve anything long term. It may have some short term effect. Of course, if you flood the street with police officers, um, you will see a short term effect. The reality is, you cannot do this forever. Now, I don't know if you guys know much about a state of emergency. A state of emergency goes way back to slavery times, believe it or not. It's a way that the slave masters used, the colonizers used, the British slave masters used when our ancestors were slaves. It's what they used to rein the slaves into back into their place if they decided to play up, if they decided to rebel. And as you may or may not know, there were lots of slave rebellions in the Caribbean during that time. Often you hear British people say, living in the UK, that they tout a very famous abolitioner in the UK called William Wilberforce. And the slave trade ended, or the transatlantic slave trade ended around 1834, meaning that the slaves taken from Africa to the Caribbean ended around 1834. The transatlantic slave trade ended around that time. And Britain liked to tout itself as the purveyors, the people that started the end of the slave trade, and something they're very proud of. They've got nothing to be proud of, but I digress. A state of emergency emerged from those times. The slave masters used a state of emergency to keep the slaves in check. If they decided to play up, they'd call a state of emergency, which means that it was obviously a lot more brutal back then than it is now. A lot more brutal.